This committee meeting is called to order. A quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order. I will start by recognizing myself and the ranking member to present our opening statements. Without objection, the members of the subcommittee can submit their remarks for the record. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna actually do something a little bit unusual. I've got to defer to my boss on the committee, our chairman, and I'm going to allow him to make the first opening statements.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also obviously want to extend my appreciation for President Uribe of Colombia, the former President of Colombia, for his being with us today. And again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing on the challenges of democracy. And I think it's timely, I think it's vital that we have a discussion about the state of democratic institutions here in our hemisphere. We are linked very, very closely with our neighbors to the north and the south, and we all benefit when democratic values are bolstered throughout this hemisphere, because those values are the values that help ensure peace. They're the values that promote free trade. They're the values that guarantee shared prosperity, that really offer people upward mobility when they're deployed, that really offer people opportunity in those types of democratic environments. And while they're great examples of healthy democratic developments in Latin America, as, of course, in the case of Colombia, President Uribe, we do have a situation where we've seen the unraveling of democratic values in several countries over the last decade. And taking cues from Cuba's dictator Fidel Castro, the late Venezuelan president, Hugo Chavez, laid the groundwork for the emergence of a populist extreme left in Latin America. And as a result, time-honored democratic principles like free and transparent elections and freedom of the press and freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, all of that has been under assault in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Nicaragua. I have been particularly concerned with the implementation of a communications law in Ecuador that serves to stifle the rights of freedom of press and expression. Passed this past June by Ecuador's National Assembly, the law creates regulatory bodies tasked with redistributing licenses equally among the private, government, and nonprofit sectors, thus dismantling much of the private media ownership in the country. These regulatory bodies will be charged with monitoring content and imposing sanctions or imposing criminal penalties if they assess subjectively that published information is not precise, contextualized, or if an outlet neglects to cover issues deemed to be in the public interest. The passage of this law is chilling to those of us who know the importance of press freedom and independence from government for the proper functioning of a free society. The language of this law is open to the whims of President Correa, who has shown himself to be anti-press, anti-free expression. In fact, according to Freedom House's annual press freedom survey, Ecuador had the world's second largest decline in press freedom over the last 5 years. The passage of a law that offers that president the sweeping and subjective control of the media will also encourage Bolivian President Evo Morales, I suspect, or President Cristina Kirchner of Argentina, to advance their own attempts at controlling dissent in the media. Through populist rhetoric, demonizing private ownership, these governments are seeking to put the executive firmly in control of media content. These types of laws do more than challenge democracy. They dismantle democratic institutions right here in the Western Hemisphere. And I am looking forward to hearing from each of the witnesses and discussing what can be done to discourage these types of abuses made cynically in the name of democracy. But again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding this hearing today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will next yield myself such time as I may consume, and then I'll recognize our ranking member to make his opening statement. Without objection, the members of the subcommittee can submit their remarks for the record, or we can have a few opening statements as long as we don't go beyond a minute. I'd like to thank my colleagues for joining me in convening this important hearing where we have the opportunity to take a close look at the challenges to freedom and democracy that exist throughout the Western Hemisphere. Since the beginning of this Congress, we focused our attention in this subcommittee on the growth and opportunity that exists throughout the region. I've long believed that the most effective way for the United States to bring freedom and democracy to people around the world is to promote principles of economic freedom, entrepreneurship, and free trade, a liberalized economic system where citizens are empowered to innovate, pursue their dreams, and decide how best to provide for their families. That's the best recipe for strengthening democratic institutions and the rule of law. Unfortunately, the Western Hemisphere is a home to several leaders intent on stifling economic growth and freedom and eroding democratic institutions and values. The erosion of democracy in Latin America is best described as authoritarianism, masked by progressive rhetoric that, ironically, claims loyalty to democratic values. The late Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, an acolyte of the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro, paved the way for the emergence of the populist left brand of authoritarianism we still see today in Venezuela, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and, regrettably, Argentina. By undermining institutions and the rule of law and threatening their opposition and the press, these leftist leaders have consolidated power and marginalized the opposition. Media laws in Ecuador, Venezuela, Argentina have blatantly stifled the basic democratic right to free press and expression. When a communications law that gives the government the power to regulate media content was passed this summer in Ecuador's National Assembly, President Correa declared that this encroachment on the right to free expression democratizes access to the news media. President Correa, like President Kirchner of Argentina and other populist leftist leaders in Latin America, have attempted to shield their very undemocratic power grabs by labeling them democratic. This shameless populist doublespeak has done much to undermine the intrinsic value democratic institutions have had in protecting the rights of individual citizens. These same leaders have further used populistic, nationalistic rhetoric to justify the squandering of vast economic resources, stifling free enterprise and free trade to the detriment of their people. Venezuela's late President Hugo Chavez nationalized major segments of industry, from oil to agriculture, as part of his socialist agenda, and that included an overt hostility to foreign investment. The result has been flagging production, record-high inflation rates, and scarcity, evident still today under his dubiously elected successor, fellow populist leftist President Nicolas Maduro. Democracies are almost always some form of market economy, and they cannot function without the rule of law. Yet the rule of law is literally under siege in many South American countries. In 2011, Argentina's President Cristina Kirchner announced the nationalization of the oil company YPF, expropriating 51% of the shares owned by the Spanish company Repsol. Her populist rhetoric declared the takeover as a victory for Argentina's energy sovereignty, but the reality has brought disappointment, as Argentina is now a net importer of energy for the first time since 1984. Argentina has been plagued by high inflation, which even questionable government figures are forced to acknowledge. Meanwhile, Argentina has been a generally inhospitable environment for the foreign investment needed to realize its true economic potential. For instance, the government consistently refuses to honor awards issued by the World Bank's International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. Instead, President Kirchner has focused her agenda on growing the public sector in an effort to further consolidate her own power. She has led the passage of media and judicial laws that represent an assault on democratic values while contemplating reform of the Argentina Constitution in order to give her another term as president. A nation so rich in natural resources and human capital is being strangled by authoritarian populism that Kirchner has admired in Hugo Chavez. As I said at the outset, a commitment to the rule of law coupled with free trade and economic liberty will lead to stronger and more vibrant democracies. We should all be encouraged by the exciting free trade bloc known as the Pacific Alliance, ongoing negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as well as the prospect that energy reforms in Mexico could bring about greater North American energy independence and security. The Western Hemisphere is commercially and culturally vibrant, and the United States should do more to encourage the opening of markets and opportunity to those nations currently strangled by populism. This will do much to empower citizens, make them less dependent on government, thereby making governments less powerful and less authoritarian. I am so pleased that former Colombian President Álvaro Uribe is here to testify on our first panel. Mr. President, I consider you to be one of the foremost leaders in the entire world of our last century. I know that the great strides that have been made in Colombia have been a direct result of your leadership and your guts and your willingness to stand up and lead. The United States has done a lot of things to try to help that happen, but it would have never happened, never, without your great leadership. As President of Colombia, you tackled a serious threat at the hands of narco-terrorists while bringing security to the people of Colombia. You worked to bring greater prosperity to your country, including with the signing of a free trade agreement with the United States. This subcommittee is eager to hear what you consider to be the major challenges to democracy in our region and how we can be a positive force to encourage the protection of democratic rights and institutions all across our hemisphere. I also want to thank the second panel of experts, Dr. Hector Chamas, Mr. Carlos Lauria, and Dr. Cynthia Arnson for being here with us to discuss the state of democracy in our hemisphere. I look forward to a productive and informative hearing and appreciate you all taking part today, and I'll now recognize the ranking member for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Especially President Uribe, who I've known for many years. Colombia wouldn't be Colombia today if you weren't around, Mr. President. Thank you for being here. Across the world, we are witnessing the implosion of anti-democratic regimes, and as a consequence, the length that some authoritarian leaders will go to in order to remain in power. As a child in Cuba, I witnessed the deterioration of democracy as the Castro regime began its decades-long stranglehold on the freedom-loving people of Cuba. Today, over 50 years later, the Castro brothers' dictatorship continues to act with impunity, restricting basic human rights, freedoms of expression, and economic opportunity. The road to democracy in the hemisphere has long been fraught with challenges. The lack of inclusive participation by all members of society in the growing economic prosperity of the region has made the Americas vulnerable to anti-democratic forces. Additionally, weak state presence and corrupt governance has allowed drug traffickers to act with impunity, while economic and fiscal insecurity has merely dampened sustainable progress and further encouraged immigration abroad. Furthermore, democratic progress has been beset by the inability to ensure political accountability, public goods and safety, and uphold the rule of law. For instance, in Mexico and in Central America, drug-related crime and violence has set back democracy and public security, while in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua, elected leaders have abused executive office to consolidate power, limit the rights and freedoms of political opponents, and dismantle institutional checks and balance. Democracy, however, has shown indications of progress. While 60 of the region's countries were ruled by authoritarian regimes in 1981, today all but Cuba are ruled by elected leaders. Nonetheless, elections do not make democracy, nor do they guarantee its depth or legitimacy. The elections of Venezuela's Hugo Chavez, Ecuador's Correa, Bolivia's Morales, and Nicaragua's Ortega are product of poor governance that failed to address crime and endemic corruption, weak institutions, and social and economic inequalities. Their emergence cannot be attributed to a failure of democracy, rather to the failure of previous leaders to advance and uphold democratic principles. As a result, the disenfranchised and democratically disillusioned citizens turn to their leaders to solve difficult economic and social problems through the undemocratic and competitively authoritarian means. Moreover, these leaders rationalize the need for themselves to stay in office in order to see their social and institutional reforms take hold. And they utilize the rents from the state-owned natural resources industry to fund their projects and further consolidate their rule. Under Chavez's 14 years rule, power in the executive was accumulated as human rights. eroded, and opposition, censorship, and intimidation and prosecution escalated. Owners of media outlets that refuse to play by the rules have been forced to sell their assets and leave the country for fear of reprisal. We have seen similar trends take hold with respect to freedoms of the press in Bolivia, Ecuador, and now Argentina, with the intimidation of journalists and media critical of the government. Mexico, consumed by the drug-related violence of cartel turf wars, is considered to be the most dangerous country in the hemisphere for journalists, as they are murdered with impunity by organized crime and corrupt officials. Similarly, troubling is the deterioration of the rule of law, as seen with diminished judicial independence and the failure to prosecute high-level officials deemed above the law. The May 2013 conviction in Guatemala of former military dictator Efraín Ríos Montt for genocide and crimes against humanity was deemed a watershed moment against the act of impunity. However, the overturning of the ruling just 10 days later questioned the state of Guatemala's rule of law and judicial independence. Paramilitary groups like Peru's Shining Path and Colombia's FARC have been significantly diminished. I am closely following the peace talk negotiations of President Santos with Colombia's FARC. If successful, Colombia could potentially free itself of a long-standing obstacle to peace and economic prosperity. Nevertheless, I am skeptical on the willingness of the FARC leadership to simply cede control and forego the revenues of drug and criminal activities. Additionally, I find the intermediary role of Cuban officials particularly dubious. I look forward to hearing from our panelists regarding the assessment of the Hemisphere's challenge to democracy. Additionally, I look forward to discussing how Congress can work with our regional neighbors to respect and advance democratic principles like free, clear, and contestable election, freedoms of assembly and press and human rights, and the rule of law. Thank you.
At 4:15, we have to go vote on the floor, but I do want to get to our panel as quickly as possible. But I would like to recognize one more opening statement with the gentlewoman from Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our great friend, President Uribe. And when talking about the theme of today's hearing, the challenges to democracy in the Western Hemisphere, we need only look no further than Cuba, where 11 million continue to be oppressed by the brutal Castro regime. Activists risk their lives on hunger strikes. Dozens of brave democracy advocates face intimidation, harassment, and beatings by regime thugs. In Venezuela and Nicaragua, millions were deprived of their basic democratic freedoms through fraudulent elections, and the leaders continue to exert control over important institutions such as the courts, the military, and the media. And these efforts have been orchestrated by ALBA nations like Bolivia and Ecuador, who continue to attempt to undermine and weaken the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. There have been some reports that Venezuela is pulling out today, and that's why I joined with Congressman Sierras to introduce the Countering ALBA Act, which would help protect human rights and democratic institutions in these countries. And the bill urges the president to sanction those individuals who are officials of or acting on behalf of ALBA nations who are responsible for the commission of serious human rights against the citizens. And I'm interested in hearing President Uribe's views on the peace talks taking place in a state sponsor of terrorism country in Cuba between FARC and Colombia. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to get to our panel of one very distinguished leader in the world. We'd like to recognize former President Uribe. He is a senior fellow now at the Bipartisan Policy Center. He did serve as president of Colombia from 2002 to 2010. During his 8 years in office, he was responsible for the transformation of Colombia from a country with limited territorial control, escalating violence, and considered by many to be a failed state into one of the most thriving, dynamic countries in our hemisphere. Congratulations. President Uribe studied law at the University of Antioquia. He received a certificate of special studies in administration and management at Harvard Extension School and a certificate in negotiation and dispute resolution at Harvard Law School. Before I recognize you to provide your testimony, I'm going to explain the lighting system there in front of you. You'll have 5 minutes to present your oral statement. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have a minute left, the light will turn yellow, and when your time has expired, the light will turn red, just like driving. I ask that you conclude your testimony once the red light comes on. After our witnesses testify, all members will have 5 minutes to ask questions. I urge my colleagues to stick to the 5-minute rule to ensure that all members get the opportunity to ask questions. President Uribe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, Congressman Series, distinguished members of the committee. I am very grateful for this invitation. I am not academic. I am a political fighter, generating controversy almost every time. Elections are not enough for democracy. In the region, I see 2 sets of countries. One is Alba. In my opinion, these countries here are in a regressive path against democracy. To consider which country is going on a progressive democracy or on a regressive democracy, I have considered 5 parameters: security, freedom of investment, social cohesion, independent institutions, and pluralistic people participation. ALBA countries led by Venezuela, they have in oil their main bond. Security. Venezuela has passed from more than 4,000 cases of homicide per year to more than 21,000. In kidnapping, from 63 to more than 1,200. At the same time, the government disregards security and has stoked violence because this government promotes social class hatred. Freedom of investment, expropriations, shortages. Venezuela has expropriated more than 4 million hectares and has to import more than 17 million tons of food. At the same time, we see problem for the freedom of investment in Ecuador, Bolivia, and Nicaragua. Ecuador enjoys good economics at this moment, has advanced a lot in infrastructure, subsidizes the poorest people, but it lacks investment confidence. Therefore, these policies, the good policies, seems not to be sustainable in the longer term. Bolivia has a similar situation with lack of investment confidence. And in Nicaragua, for investors to prosper, they need to be close friends of the government. These countries have included in their agendas social policies, but with the lack of investment, these social policies are not sustainable. Independent institutions. In Venezuela, there was a coup d'etat against the Congress elected 2 years ago. Pluralistic people participation. In some of these countries, members of the opposition are taken to trial or even to jail. The cases more notorious are in Venezuela and Bolivia. Restriction to free media all across these countries. In Ecuador, I want to say that the restrictions create distrust in the business community. On the other side, progressive democracies, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Peru, Brazil, Uruguay. With the exception of Uruguay, these democracies have some challenges. The youth unemployment is very high, in between 17 and 23. These progressive democracies have to face this challenge, the aspiration of the middle classes. They have to follow the example of Mexico to aggregate value to the commodity-based economy and the free trade agreement with the United States. For people to legitimize these free trade agreements, people have to perceive that these free trade agreements are convenient for all these countries, not only for industrialized countries. And of course, in Central America, they have made significant progress in democratic values, but they, in my opinion, need much more help for the international community for them to overcome violence and the growing trade of illicit drugs. In Venezuela, one of the main problems is that the government harbors terrorists from all over the world and promotes an anti-Semite speech. For the first time, I am on time to finish my introductory remarks.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your statement. Before I ask questions, I'd like to recognize our Peruvian Ambassador, Harold Forsyth. Thank you for coming today. Also would like to do just a little shout out. Our summer intern's last day is today. Thomas Harrigan, thank you for all your hard work this last summer. Really appreciate you. Mr. President, I'm concerned that in many countries, respect for effective rule of law seems to be weakening. And in some cases, it is the government itself that's the prime instigator of that shift. Do you share this concern? And if so, what countries and what can be done?
One of the main violations of the rule of law, Mr. Chairman, is the gradual elimination of independent institutions. In Venezuela, and in some degree in Ecuador and Bolivia and Nicaragua, the executive branches have overtaken the justice administration. And they take advantage of this dominance of the justice administration to proceed against dissidents. It is a very grave violation of the rule of law.
Thank you. In the aftermath of the death of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, what are Venezuela's political prospects in terms of restoring checks and balances to this political system? And what has been the Maduro government's track record on respect for the rights of the minority or freedom of expression? What are the prospects of the December local elections, that they'll be conducted freely and fairly? And how do you characterize media freedom in Venezuela now that the last remaining television station critical of the government, Globovision, has been sold to a group of businessmen with links to the Venezuelan government?
Some journalists have fled to foreign countries. Other journalists are intimidated, and they cannot openly express their opinions. The government has bought media and has promoted the purchase of media by its own friends. At the same time, the government has taken advantage of its influence on the justice administration to go after independent journalists. Fraud. In past elections, there were rumors of fraud. But in the election this year that elected President Maduro, there was evidence of fraud, evidence of fraud. The economic situation is very severe because of the shortage, and the macroeconomics have impaired. For instance, Venezuela was a country with a public indebtedness that represented no more than 24% of the GDP. Now it represents in between 70 and 80% of the GDP. Therefore, the situation is very complicated. The private sector is under permanent threat, the same the freedoms.
In your testimony, you mentioned that Chavez's economic policies continued by Nicolas Maduro have placed Venezuela at high economic risk and clearly undermined democratic governance. In your opinion, what countries in Latin America are implementing some of the sound policies, economic policies, that represent democratic governance and contribute to economic prosperity?
I will mention Mexico, Costa Rica, some other Central American countries, Panama, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Uruguay, and we are very hopeful with Paraguay and, of course, Brazil. And I am very hopeful for what is known as the Alliance for the Pacific, that included some of these countries. They are working with all the democratic values, but they face many challenges. One challenge is to make the reduction of poverty quicker. Other challenge is to provide the youth people with opportunities because of the high level of youth unemployment. And at the same time, to combine the knowledge-based economy with the commodities-based economy.
Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back the balance of my time, and I yield 5 minutes for questions for to the ranking member, Mr. Cirrus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President, I'd like your view, because I have a very different view of what's going on in Cuba in terms of the changes and where you see that leading the Cuban people. Obviously, I feel that they're just trying to soften their world, how can I say, what world thinks of Cuba. So I would just like to see, I would like to hear from you what you think this is going to lead in terms of, is it really a change, or is it just a facade?
Mr. Congressman, ranking member, when we compare Cuba with China, China has gone much far in economic openness than Cuba. In my opinion, the economic openness of Cuba is only an excuse. It's only for appearance. And there is no political openness. Therefore, in my opinion, this economic openness in Cuba won't be enough to satisfy the basic needs of the people of Cuba. Cuba has been a failure. First, Cuba survived because of the subsidy of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Cuban economy dropped by 40%. After, Cuba got the Chavez government subsidy. And now, Cuba has subsidized loans from Brazil, for instance, to build the Mariel port, and at the same time, the growing amount of money that is transferred from the United States to the Cuban families. Therefore, I don't see enough signs for the better off of the people of Cuba.
Thank you. One of the complaints that I receive in my office when I receive people from Central America is the issue of corruption. They want to invest more in the region, but they feel that the corruption is too risky with the corruption in some of these countries. Can you talk a little bit about corruption in the region?
Of course. The main remedy against corruption is the independence of institutions and the total openness for people participation. For instance, when I was president, to assign every contract in my government, it was necessary to have a public hearing on TV. Therefore, all the bidders had the opportunity to discuss their proposals. When a country eliminates the independence of institutions, the country is much more willing to have growing corruption. Therefore, independent institutions eliminated gradually in some of the countries are a path to increase corruption.
Can you talk a little bit about the Merida initiative? I know that is pretty much in the same mold of what we try to do in Colombia, but I don't know if we have the kind of backing from the country that we had in Colombia. Can you talk a little bit about that?
In Mexico?
In Mexico.
In my opinion, President Calderon did a great job, because in the absence of President Calderon's fight against the drug cartels, Mexico was not as he is today. In Mexico, there is optimism. In my opinion, President Calderon recovered the predominance of the institutions over the drug cartels. And this policy has allowed President Peña Nieto to promote the new structural reforms that the Mexican economy needs. But these structural reforms, in my opinion, are going to produce very good output under the condition that Mexico never forget that they have to fight drug cartels.
Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the former, actually, Chairman Emeritus of this committee, this full committee, the gentlewoman from Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It's a delight to have President Uribe with us. As Congressman Nasir has talked about, corruption is such a deep problem in our hemisphere, the lack of the rule of law, weak institutions. All of these factors continue to plague many countries in Latin America, and this prevents democratic forces from flourishing, from growing. And we continue to see many leaders more in the ALBA nations manipulate elections, move away from democratic principles, and once they're in power, these rogue leaders change the rules of the game. They manipulate the legislative system, the electoral councils, the judicial systems in their favor to hold on to power at any cost. And at the same time, we see countries like Colombia and Chile do well economically because of the stability and the implementation of regulations that promote trade and open markets. But these democratic advances, as we've seen, continue to be threatened by narco-terrorism, by violence, by the lack of political will, by corruption. And you are a leader who can really speak on the issue of narco-terrorism, FARC, because the great progress that you made in Colombia in the struggle against this terrorist group during your presidency. As we know, peace talks have been underway. Sometimes they get halted between the Colombian government and the FARC, and they're being held in a very unlikely place in Cuba, which is a state sponsor of terrorism. I wanted to know your opinion about whether Cuba, a state sponsor of terrorism, is a proper forum in which to have these peace talks, and do you believe that the FARC will dismantle its terrorist network, abandon their efforts on illicit activities as a result of these talks? And then also related to Nicolas Maduro, remains very much in control in Venezuela. Do you think that his control will continue, or do you see there's a lot of talk about maybe getting rid of him, putting in another stooge who will continue this farce? And then in Ecuador, as we talked about here, the manipulation of this referendum to eliminate the print media by forcing them to go digital. And he's not the only one who's been threatening the press. And then lastly, about the OAS, which has such a lack of leadership, which could be a real institution for democracy and for the rule of law. And what reforms do you think are possible in the OAS so that it can be living up to the principles upon which it was founded? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mrs. Congresswoman. When I was president and my government was inaugurated, my predecessor, President Pastrana, had two initiatives for peace. One with the paramilitary groups through the Catholic Church, and the other with the ELN through the Cuban government. I said, we are ready to continue these talks under the condition that these criminal groups make the decision to unilaterally cease all their criminal activities. And we tried to advance in Cuba with the ELN, but the ELN did not accept our claim. And I had the opportunity to talk to President Castro, and he said to me that he no longer had influence on FARC. And I believe in what he said to me, because FARC is very rich and arrogant. With the incursion of FARC in narco-trafficking, FARC no longer need the help of Cuba. Therefore, going to the case of Venezuela, I can understand why from midnight to early morning, Venezuela has passed from being the promoter of terrorist groups and becoming the promoter of peace. I cannot accept this. And in the case of Ecuador, when the government of Ecuador says that they are in need of having communitarian and social media, they are right. But it could not be at the expenses of free independent media. It could be an excuse to, at the end, to eliminate every expression of independent media. Going to the Organization of American States, it has been very weak. I cannot understand why they adopt one stand in the case of Honduras, one stand in the case of Paraguay, and they do not say anything against the coup d'etat in Venezuela against the new Congress 2 years ago. And I want to conclude with this. We should not ask for replacing the Organization of American States. The region needs democratic governments in joint action to make all the region to comply with the democratic chart of the Organization of American States. No one could be the police in the region, but we need to reform and to review and to rethink what will be the role of the Organization of American States, because it seems that the Organization of American States depends on the whims of some dictators or quasi-dictators and are not ruled by its own chart. And finally, Mrs. Congresswoman, I am very critical of some of the steps in Colombia at this moment. However, I prefer to say what I did, what were my wrongdoings, what Colombia need more at the moment of the end of my terms than here to criticize the current government. I am a daily fighter in my country. Therefore, I have to keep the criticism to my country for my country. And
Thank you, sir.
I accept that. I understand that you will accept this excuse.
I sure do. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Faleme Vega.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, our ranking member, for convening this hearing. I would also like to extend my personal welcome to His Excellency, the Honorable Alvaro Uribe, the former President of the Republic of Colombia. I'm impressed that in less than 25 years, 16 countries in the Western Hemisphere have transitioned from authoritarian regimes to governments by elected leaders. Such a monumental achievement is a testament to the backbreaking work and tireless dedication of the Canadians and Latin Americans and Caribbean people. Yet I am aware and sure that our witnesses will instruct us even more in terms of what needs to be done. As our Secretary of State, Kerry, stated, and I quote, "The Western Hemisphere is our backyard. It is of vital importance to us. Too often, many countries in the Western Hemisphere feel that the United States does not give them enough attention, and sometimes this is probably true. We need to be closer, and we plan to do it." End of quote. And I could not agree more with Secretary Kerry's observation about this in all the years that I've been a member of this subcommittee. Mr. President, my question, and first question, is that what is the role, both positive and negative, has the United States played in the development of democracy in this region? What successes and failures have we contributed to? My second question is that, and correct me if I make this as an observation, that may be one of the serious problems that Latin America has always been confronted with, is the extreme social and economic inequalities existing in the societies of the different Latin American countries. And I believe that with this inequality, it does affect the government institutions, leading to corruption, trafficking, and all these negative aspects of what has been discussed earlier this morning. And one area that I am of particular interest in, would certainly like to ask for your comments and your insights, is that of all the testimonies that I've read this morning, not one item ever mentions the fact of the plight, the suffering of the indigenous Indian populations that make up practically every one of these Latin American countries. I've met with delegations of the various indigenous tribes that have come throughout Latin America, and it's the same story, Your Excellency. They are the West, not just bottom of the barrel, they're below bottom of the barrel when it comes to economic, social conditions, educational opportunities. They're the worst off. somewhat very similar to what the American Indians are going through right now, even in our own country. I'd just like to start with those two questions, Mr. President, if I could. Your response.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. Indigenous people. There are countries that are making significant progress. During the Barco administration in Colombia between 1986 and 1990.
Oh, and by the way, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I do want to say my highest commendation for the achievements that you made at the time when you served as president. You reduced the kidnappings by 80% in Colombia, and as high as 50% reduction in homicides, and as high as 90% of terrorist attacks in your country because of your leadership and your commitment to public service, and I want to commend you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. But we did not only work for security. Our democratic security policy had other two companions. The policy to promote investment and the policy to advance in social cohesion. At the same time, we reduced poverty, we reduced unemployment. We began to improve income distribution. My country, and before my administration, since many years ago, had made significant progress in dealing with the indigenous communities. And in my country, many governments have worked to assign them land titles, to give them educational possibilities, to give their children possibilities for nutrition, to give them access to health services, and so on. But I agree with you that we need to do much more in order to overcome poverty and in order to eliminate these big inequalities. But one aspect, distinguished Congressman, it is necessary to take hand in hand investment with social cohesion. If you only want to create social opportunities and at the same time you are hostile against the private sector, you won't have the necessary resources to sustain social cohesion. The role of the United States, I won't say, with all the, and I apologize for this, that Latin America is the backyard. Latin America and the Caribbean is the front yard of these North American countries. And at this moment, we cannot say that we need the United States as the police of the region, but we need a group of democratic countries, the United States, Canada, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Uruguay, that it has a leftist government, but with all the respect for democratic values. We need, it does not matter that they are center-left or center-right. What matters is that they are progressive democratic countries with the rule of law. We need this group of countries to review the Organization of American States, to make that the democratic chart be complied with by all the countries. I remember, and I finish with this, the play many democratic countries, the role many democratic countries play for Chile to push out Pinochet, for Peru to push out Fujimori. And what is the reason for silence? In the case of Maduro in Venezuela, I cannot understand. Democratic value, the rule of law, should prevail over any ideological willingness.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. My time's way over. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. President, for being here today. I was reading your written testimony, and you point out regional success stories of Chile and Uruguay. And when I was reading there, it says Chile represents one of the most developed democracies in the region, and Uruguay has demonstrated strong institutions of vibrant democracy. They are key ingredients for economic and social progress. But I could say that Colombia is the epitome of what success looks like in South America. When we were down there, the ranking member and I, and he's left now, but we were down there in Cartagena for the Summit of the Americas, and we met with some congressmen from Colombia. And one thing that struck me was three things that they talked about. They talked about that Colombia is pursuing low taxation, corporate taxes and individual taxes, a debt-to-GDP ratio of 4% or less, and just enough government to support a free market. These are American principles. This is what made this country great, and I see Colombia applying those principles, and then I see Chile, Uruguay, Peru, even Brazil, Mexico to some degree, putting the principles in place that made America great, and you're seeing a tremendous economic and political progress in Latin America. I read also that Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay represent 70% of the regional's population, 75% of the regional GDP. That's pretty strong. When you compare, when you factor in Brazil and Argentina and their GDP as well. So thank you for that. Every instance I've had to go to Colombia, I have been impressed. And I think it falls back on your shoulders, the leadership that you provided that Chairman Salmon talked about earlier. When we were down for seeing the cooperation between the U.S. and the Colombian military with regard to helicopters and the 10-year, $10 billion investment the U.S. made in cooperation with Colombia and the effect it's had on pushing back the narco trafficking, pushing back FARC to the borders. That came under your leadership, so I just say thank you for that. You speak of the importance of reforming the OAS. How can the U.S. affect the reform, and what do you think would be most helpful for the U.S. as far as helping Colombia and other countries reform the OAS?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. My main concern is that the Organization of American States needs to be much more strict on preserving the democratic chart than it has been so far. Therefore, I don't know exactly what are the regulations that the organization needs to be introduced. In my opinion, it is necessary to have political determination, because it seems that the Organization of American States fears the government of Venezuela, fears the government of Ecuador. They are very strong against what happened, what did happen in Honduras, very strong against what happened in Paraguay, but they have been very weak in regarding Venezuela and Ecuador and Bolivia. Therefore, much more than regulation, it is necessary to adopt political determination to preserve democratic values, the rule of law all over the region.
Well, thank you for that. I believe you're right, and I believe Colombia is leading by example with individual freedoms, with economic prosperity. Those are the things I think the neighboring countries will notice. I think they do notice it, and when you see what's going on in Bolivia and Venezuela, Ecuador, the best example that those folks can look toward is to Colombia. And I just, in my limited time, I just want to point out that the South Carolina National Guard has a sister states relationship and the state partnership program with the Colombian air helos and their army. So we're glad to watch from Columbia, South Carolina to Colombia, South America, the progress and have that sister relationship. So thank you again. I enjoyed the testimony and the questioning today, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Radel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, being members of Congress, we have a bit of a megaphone here. And in today's discussion, we keep hearing the same names, the same countries over and over, and our very serious and legitimate concerns with those countries. But with that very same megaphone that we have, I would also urge the people of those countries to know and to understand that at the end of the day, we all want the same things for ourselves and for our children. Oportunidad y libertad, opportunity and freedom for all. And let there be no question that the Honorable Presidente Uribe, in front of us right now, has led the charge in Latin America of being able to show and exemplify how, when we as countries work together, we create more opportunity in our own country. And what has happened in Colombia is nothing short of amazing. And that's because of your leadership, and we thank you for that. And we cherish the relationship that we have with you. One thing, though, that I think also right now is threatening parts of Latin America and the opportunity and freedom that we're all looking for is organized crime. I think that it could potentially lead to a political backlash of erosion of civil liberties in particular, and others. That said, let's take a look at the violence that has plagued Mexico. I would ask you, could we use Colombia as an example of where foreign aid and cooperating when it comes to national security, where we can work together? But Mr. President, I would also ask this, in the context of this, if we are talking about narco-traffickers, if we do the same in Mexico, are we simply going to end up pushing the problem somewhere else?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. I want to express my gratitude to the comments some of you have made, and I want to remember that the United States has been very helpful to my country. And it is not a question of bilateral relations between Colombia and the United States. The fight against organized crime, terrorist groups, should be a universal fight. And one of the problems I see in the region is the penetration of other terrorist groups, different than FARC, to the region through the government of Venezuela. This is the case of the connection with Hezbollah and other terrorist groups. Mexico, in my opinion, has advanced a lot, but it is necessary that every country be ready to support Mexico with whatever Mexico requests, because, you know, we need to respect the sovereignty of every country. And at the same time, I am very concerned because of impunity in countries. This is not the case of Mexico. It could be the case of my country, because impunity is the midwife of new violence. Therefore, peace talks should never be at the expense of justice. At the same time, illicit drugs. I want only to bring one example. The constitutional provision of my country, enacted in the year 2009, stated that 3 points. First, addicts, consumers, must never be taken to jail, always to hospital, to rehabilitation. Second, there should be prevalent policies on prevention, on education. And third, narco traffickers and distributors, street distributors, transnational narco traffickers, all of them should be taken to jail. Don't remember, FARC is the main drug cartel all over the world and has all the connections with the Mexican cartels. Therefore, it is necessary to have a universal fight. You have expressed one concern. What is Mexico succeeds as it is going on in this country, and at the same time, the drug cartels flee from Mexico to the Central American countries. Therefore, it is necessary to have a universal policy against the drug cartels.
With 7 seconds left, again, thank you so much for being here today. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Gracias por venir.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. We really appreciate your willingness to come. It truly is an honor, and thank you for all the great leadership you provided, not just for Colombia, but for the world.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you, distinguished members of the committee. It has been a great honor.
Thank you. I move that we install our next panel, and with regard to some of the time constraints, I'm going to dispense with introductions. I apologize. You deserve very flowery introductions, but in the interest of time, I'd like to move quickly. Thank you. Again, I apologize for dispensing with introductions, but I'd really like to get to the meat of the testimony, and we will probably be called to vote in about 15 minutes, and so I want to make sure we hear from all of you that have waited for and been patient for so long. So I'm going to start out with Dr. Shamus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here sharing this panel with good friends. And I appreciate your concern with this important subject. I don't want to speak too long because time is short and you have more important things to do, I guess, today. But I would reiterate something that I put in writing here, which is that the single most critical challenge to democracy today in the region, it is, in my view, the impermanency of constitutional rules. It has become customary for incumbent presidents to modify constitutional rules with the immediate goal of getting themselves reelected for another term, or for an indefinite number of terms, which generates, I would say, a whole set of pathologies of political life. And that has happened, as we discuss here, in a variety of countries, and in much more countries that we don't remember, perhaps. But it has happened in the Dominican Republic, and it has happened in Honduras, and it has happened even in Brazil, even if it didn't lead to the perpetuation of anyone in power. And that generates a bad example. That generates this idea that, well, rules are flexible, and that rules can be changed. And indeed, constitutions are somehow flexible, but occasionally, not all the time. And also, constitutions are not there to be changed for the benefit of the incumbent president. That generates, again, a toxic political environment. When that happens, these constitutional tricks, these quasi-constitutional re-election processes in Ecuador or in Venezuela or in Bolivia and so on and so forth, it generates a dramatic concentration of power in the executive, by definition, and that affects also some of the fundamental principles of democracy, which is checks and balances and separation of powers. As a result as well, there is a heightened concentration of authority in the executive, which turns executive branches into legislating executives at the expense of Congress. And rule by decree has become customary. That has generated a contradiction between the majority rule and minority rights. It has become quite frequent the case there majority rule is invoked to violate the rights of the minority, whether those minorities are political parties in a minority or ethnic minorities, as the Congressman suggested, is irrelevant in the sense that it happens equally to whoever is a minority in this context in which majority rule is the pretext for violating those rights. Judiciaries have been at risk, judges have been intimidated, judges have been harassed, Supreme Courts have been packed, and the cases, again, we have discussed them over and over again. The most tragic consequence, in my view, of this has been increasing violence, and particularly increasing violence to a particular group of people, journalists. And I'm sure Carlos Lauria here will address that issue in detail, but it has become quite frequent, a range of state actions on the part of elected governments that somewhere I've called new authoritarianism in the region, but it has become frequent for these governments to go from censorship to mild censorship and intimidation to harassment to manipulation of the courts against journalists, all the way to assassination and rape. In the case of, there is a documentation in which in certain countries where violence against journalists has been diffuse, has been prominent, the case in which if those journalists had been female journalists, rape has also taken place, a particular form of violence. And therefore we are in a situation in which the mutilation of press freedom, as I call it here, is the single most critical deficit of democracy and political life in the region as a whole. I want to conclude with two things. One is, or three things, I would say. One is, President Uribe said that it doesn't matter very much whether they're right or left, and I agree with him. It doesn't even matter whether they're more or less populist, which is a common word that has been pronounced here and is pronounced in debates, in the press, in the political, in the academic and the political debates. It doesn't even matter that. And let me illustrate that with one example. In 2009, one of those presidents, at times, one of those presidents in Latin America, at times called a populist, certainly a leftist, a former labor leader, President Lula of Brazil. In 2009, he was approaching the end of his second term in office. His popularity was above 80%. A reporter asked him in a press conference why wasn't he going to change the constitution and stay in office. His popularity was above 80% at the time, his 7th year in office. And he said, no, because democracy is about two things, constitutional rules and alternation in power. And here we have someone we have called leftist, for sure, a labor leader from industrial Sao Paulo, and a populist in some other commentary. Well, he rejected that. So ultimately, it doesn't matter that much how they call themselves or how we call them, whether it's populist, leftist, or rightist, or et cetera, et cetera. The second point I want to make is that a question that has been already asked here is, what can we do? What can we do as a community in the hemisphere, I would say, the OAS? I think what we can do is highlight and constantly point fingers to these bad practices at the OAS, but at the summits. There are regional summits that go on with speeches forever, and the conversation goes from trade to infrastructure and integration, very nice things, while many of these governments are abusing the rules and abusing their citizens, therefore. And it's not that important in the context of Latin America today that the US does it, but that the US does it in combination with many other quite democratic countries in the region. The question is not so much, or the puzzle is not so much whether the US is saying something, but why isn't Chile and Brazil and Uruguay saying something to their counterparts in those regional summits? And that is a puzzle that I legitimately present here as an honest puzzle, intellectual puzzle, if you want. The final point is there is a label by which we have addressed these realities of politics, which we owe to a commentator and author, Fareed Zakaria, which is illiberal democracy. Let me say that we are getting to a point in which in Latin America, illiberalism has turned that idea of illiberal democracy into an oxymoron. Without liberalism, with that level of illiberalism, there is no democratic politics possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shamus. Mr. Loria, and I'd like to just ask the panelists again to watch the lighting system, and red means stop. So thank you very much, Dr. Loria, or Mr. Loria.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to commend you and the members of the House Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere for holding this important hearing and for providing the Committee to Protect Journalists with the opportunity to testify before you. I'm CPJ's America's Senior Program Coordinator. CPJ is an independent nonprofit organization dedicated to defend press freedom worldwide. And Mr. Chairman, my statement today will summarize the issues raised in my written testimony. I would like to highlight the threats that journalists face while reporting the news and its impact on fundamental human rights. In different countries, broad aspects of public discourse are limited by the threat of violence, government censorship, restrictive laws, and financial pressures. The lack of debate on issues of public interest is creating political instability, reducing government accountability, and compromising economic development. With the exception of Cuba, democracy in the Americas has become entrenched. While many countries in the region have great investigative journalism, reporters and media outlets are still exposed to both violence and government repression, which are the emerging trends that illustrate the major challenges facing the press in the hemisphere. During the last 20 years, transnational criminal groups have extended their sway and spread a wave of little violence in Latin America. Scores of reporters have been killed or disappeared with impunity, as dysfunctional justice systems have been incapable to solve these crimes. With more than 50 journalists killed or disappeared over the last 6 years, Mexico is the deadliest country for the press in the Americas and one of the most dangerous worldwide. Terror and censorship have devastated the news media while placing Mexico's democracy at risk. Criminal organizations and impunity have also forced the press into silence in some Central American countries, but nowhere more so than in Honduras. With the highest homicide rate in the world, according to UN statistics, a climate of wild violence and widespread impunity had made this country one of the most dangerous in the region. Even as little violence has drastically declined in the last decade, as expressed by former President Uribe here in this panel before, Colombia continues to rank among the most murderous countries for journalists in the world, with 44 journalists killed in direct reprisal for their work since 1992. This year, unfortunately, CPJ has documented a series of press freedom cases that illustrate the serious risks journalists still face when reporting on sensitive issues. Besides the threat of physical violence, the subsequent most pressing issue for the regional media is an array of restrictive measures imposed by democratically elected governments. Showing disdain for the institutions of democracy, several governments are seeking to stifle dissent and control the flow of information. Venezuela provides the starkest example of the lack of tolerance to different views and opinions. In the last 14 years, Venezuela has used different laws, regulatory measures, judicial decisions to progressively break down the private press. Authorities have closed dozens of broadcasters, censored critical coverage, and sued reporters for defamation. Venezuela has served as a model to other leaders in the region who are trying to repress dissent and control information. But perhaps none has learned a lesson better than President Rafael Correa of Ecuador, whose policies have transformed the country into one of the hemisphere's most restrictive nations for the press. Ecuador has made use of archaic criminal defamation laws to silence critical journalists, and the new communications law, which establishes regulation of editorial content and gives authorities the power to censor the press, represents a severe blow to freedom of expression. In the last few years, Cuba has projected an image of a nation opening up economically, but the government has taken no actions to promote freedom of expression and access to information. Finally, and being in Washington today, I must mention recent developments that have worsened the climate for press freedom in the United States. Actions taken by the U.S. Department of Justice in seizing journalists' phone records and emails, the aggressive prosecution of whistleblowers who leak information to the press, classify information to the press, and massive surveillance of communications send a chilling message to journalists and their sources, particularly on issues of national security that are of vital importance to the public. At the same time, just as troubling, these actions in the United States set a terrible example to the rest of the world, where governments routinely justify intervention in the media by citing national security. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Ms. Deloria. Dr. Arntzen.
And members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify today. tomorrow, September 11th, is not only the anniversary of the terrorist attacks against the United States, but also marks the 40th anniversary of the military coup in Chile. The commemorations that are underway in Santiago and other major cities throughout the country show how the reckoning with the legacy of those abuses, the search for justice, the search to end impunity, continues to pose tasks for Chilean society, even this many decades after the formal transition to democracy. In terms of democratic governance, I agree with my colleagues, there's much to celebrate since the 1960s and 70s and 80s, when many countries in the region were in the grip of military dictatorship or civil war. But I would like to refer you to my testimony to summarize some of those, and rather focus on the setbacks to representative democracy in the Andean region, but also broader challenges to democratic governance in those countries, even where liberal democracy is strong. First, and despite the significant strides in reducing poverty and more limited steps in reducing inequality over the last decade, the region as a whole remains the most unequal region in the world. Social mobility has improved, millions have entered the middle class, but they remain highly vulnerable to falling back into poverty. Frustration with corruption, with the poor quality of services, and with the unequal distribution of the fruits of economic growth remains high, and sparking protests from Chile to Brazil to Colombia, as we have seen in these recent weeks. Second, in many countries, electoral democracy survives amidst new threats. The unprecedented increase in the rates of crime and violence, abetted but not entirely caused by the growing activities and sophistication of transnational organized crime. My colleague, Mr. Lauria, has pointed to the attacks on the media in places like Honduras and Mexico, including those who have reported on organized crime. Latin America as a whole has a homicide rate that is more than double the global average. It is second only to parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and with the notable exception of Colombia, it is increasing in most countries, disproportionately affecting young men, particularly in urban areas. And as has been mentioned in earlier remarks, this is an especially grave problem in Central America as well as parts of the Caribbean. In addition to these overall trends that affect many countries of the region, is the growing authoritarianism of regimes in the Andean region and with echoes in places such as Argentina and Nicaragua. In previous testimony, my colleagues have outlined many of the difficulties. I'll summarize, I think, some of the most egregious. Today's populist regimes in Latin America are focused on transformational or revolutionary projects that concentrate power in the executive and do not envision ceding power to political opponents. Even when leaders enjoy significant popular support, largely as a result of social programs that have been supported by the high prices of basic commodities, the institutions and legal frameworks that constrain power have been systematically eroded. Constitutional reforms have done away with limits on presidential terms. There has been the weakening or elimination of checks and balances through the packing of institutions such as judiciaries and electoral councils. Leaders themselves foster actively the polarization of society from above, and politics is lived not as a process of bargaining with accepted rules of the game, but as a full-blown confrontation between irreconcilable interests. Populism's authoritarian qualities are most evident and advanced in Venezuela. Since his victory by a razor-thin margin in April of 2013, Nicolás Maduro has struggled to establish his authority. The opposition has refused to recognize the legitimacy of his election amidst numerous credible allegations of fraud. The government has failed to thoroughly investigate reliable reports of violence against opponents during the electoral period in April, at the same time that it conducts thorough investigations of incidents in which the opposition is alleged to be responsible. The erosion of media freedoms and of political space for autonomous civil society, the aggressive concentration of power in the hands of the presidency, the destruction of checks and balances, the assault on the very notion of political pluralism and alternation in power, and the fostering of polarization at all levels of society These characteristics of contemporary populism constitute the new face of authoritarianism in Latin America. But they are not the only threats to democracy and democratic governance in the region. To conclude, efforts to support democracy must include policies to improve citizen security, combat organized crime and its corruption at all levels of society, and foster inclusionary growth and development that benefit the region's citizens more broadly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arson. We'll now turn to the questioning phase of our hearing. And given the time constraints that we have, I'll limit each member, including myself, to 3 minutes. I just have one question, and Dr. Shamus, I would like to direct it to you. While Argentina has high Freedom House ratings for political rights and civil liberties, the government of President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner enacted a controversial media law regulating broadcast and print media. How would you characterize the current status of media freedom in Argentina and the government's effort to break up the media concentration? What is your view of recent efforts by the Argentine government to provide for the election of magistrates to oversee the judiciary? More broadly, how would you assess the current state of democracy in Argentina?
Mr. Chairman, yes. One could say that the current government of Argentina has conducted a double strategy to try to stay in power longer than elected for. Control of the media, control of information, in the form of legislation that, while it was written in simple antitrust law, was no more than an attempt to break down the main media organization in the country and take away different outlets, whether radio or audiovisual or print, and give it to friends. And that has already started to happen, and now it's up to the Supreme Court to decide on the constitutionality of that law. The second strategy of the government to stay in office was to have control of the so-called magistratura, which is an organ, an institution that appoints, nominates judges, and to invoke in the name of democratization of justice and make those appointments electable through political party lists. That law would have control of the nomination and appointment of judges, including the electoral courts, which at a time in which re-election, indefinite re-election was in the minds of many people in the government, that would have been, extremely convenient. However, the Supreme Court, in a 6-1 ruling, determined the inconstitutionality of that reform, in what introduced, I have to say, a breath of fresh air into Argentine society and politics. Recently, there's been an election. The government didn't do well, and there is all of a sudden a lot less, if any, talk of re-election. And there is an upcoming election in October, in which the government has gone from 54% in 2011 to 26% just now. And much of that has to do with the, I would say, courageous attitude taken by the judiciary, and also by Argentine society that has expressed in a clear and loud way its rejection of any attempts of perpetuity on the part of the government. And therefore, we'll see what happens with the ruling of the Supreme Court on the constitutional status of this law. But overall, the climate in Argentina, both in terms of freedom of expression and independence of the courts, has improved dramatically from just, I would say, 6 months ago.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fallima-Vega.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I actually had 100 more questions I wanted to ask our panel, but thank you so much for the testimonies you've given. Let me just ask just one question, and I'd like to ask all three of you to comment on it. We got problems of a permanent constitutional framework of how these governments are lacking, and then the problem of absolutely no freedom of the press and what they're doing to the journalists. And then Dr. Aronson's observation, the fact that corrupt governments are also as a major cause of instability that we have in Latin countries. I had asked earlier, President Uribe, could you give me, each one of you, what you consider to be the top priority of what we need to do in dealing with Latin America? Dr. Aronson.
In terms of supporting democratic governance, I think it's obvious that the United States needs to use its voice and prestige on behalf of people, on behalf of democratic systems and on behalf of those who are struggling to preserve and advance the cause of democracy in the region. When I say that, I also note that the involvement of the United States, for example, in supporting overtly the opposition in Venezuela or Bolivia or Ecuador, is not something that the opposition itself is in favor of, and it's often the kiss of death. And so it's very complicated to find ways concretely to support, other than rhetorically and verbally, to support democracy and civil society. There are restrictions on the flow of funds to civil society organizations in virtually every country in the Andean populous region.
What about, I have to interrupt, what about the fact that 85% of all the small arms that come to Mexico comes from the United States? Right. And causing one of the serious problems. And I'm sorry, we can get into that discussion, but I need to get to Mr. Lauria and Doctor, what do you consider to be the top priority of what we should do as a country to deal with Latin America?
Sure. First of all, I think that the issue of killings and disappearances of journalists should be part of the bilateral agenda of the U.S. On talks with Mexico and other countries like Honduras and even Brazil, where journalists are killed with total impunity. That's an important point. And I think that another point is it was expressed before that a group of countries of the ALBA bloc are aggressively attacking one of the models systems in the protection and promotion of human rights in the hemisphere in the world, which is the Inter-American System of Human Rights. The U.S. should work with regional countries, heavyweights like Mexico and Brazil, to strongly support the Inter-American human rights systems. Reforms like the ones proposed by the ALBA could really weaken the Inter-American human rights system, the Inter-American Commission and its special rapporteur. And this is the last line of defense for citizens in the Americas when their human rights are violated.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's up.
Thank you. Mr. Riedel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've worked as a journalist all of my life. Started as an intern at CNN. I've worked in radio, print, TV. So this is something near and dear to my heart. I firmly believe, for the record, that without a free press, you are not a free country in any way, shape, or form. My question, Mr. Lauria, would actually be with respect to Cuba. I guess it'd be the Cuba question without Mr. Sears or Ms. Ross-Leighton here today. We've seen some economic reforms, and I put gigantic, sarcastic quotation marks around reforms in Cuba. But I'd ask you, has there been any sort of reform to move toward a freer press or even freedom of discussion in the country of Cuba?
Thank you for your question. I think it's a very important one. Unfortunately, despite the opening up in the economic and political aspects, there's been no attempt by the Cuban government to promote freedom of expression and even access to information. There's a project recently implemented in Cuba, a cable fiber optic project financed by Venezuela that was going to provide more internet infrastructure. That's not available for the Cubans. The government has changed its policy of long-term detentions for short-term detentions, but harassments, intimidation, and beatings of independent journalists and political dissidents continue to be widespread.
And to clarify that too, then the technology that they're putting into the country is simply used for government officials and what, potentially tourists that show up?
Well,
They want to have internet access?
it's for government officials or for, people that have close ties with the government.
Sure.
Yes. Yeah. Common citizens have no access to internet and have to rely on internet cafes or hotels to get access.
All right. To all three of you, thank you so much for your time today. I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you to our distinguished panel. This has been a very enlightening hearing today. We're proud of the job that most of the countries in the Western Hemisphere have done protecting human rights and promoting freedom and democracy. But we have some challenges, some bumps in the road that we're all going to have to work together to try to overcome. And so I appreciate your testimony and shedding the light on some issues that need to be examined and corrected. And we applaud your efforts. Thank you very much. Without any other business, this committee will now adjourn.